these webinars, but unfortunately he can't make it today. So I, as well as organising it, have got the responsibility to chair it as well, which I'm very, very pleased to do. For those of you who are not regular attenders or regular AFINet members, let me say that AFINet, which is Addiction and the Family International Network, exists to bring together practitioners and researchers and policymakers and experts by experience who are all interested or involved in the effects that someone's problematic use of alcohol or other drugs or gambling has on the other members of their family and on other people close to them. We've got more than 650 members from more than 55 countries across the world. We had our 55th country join us yesterday. Surprisingly, our first member from France. So I was very pleased about that. You can learn more about AFINet from our website, and if you're not already a member, you can join for free by completing the application form on the website. Among the things that AFINet does are our conferences and our webinar series. In alternate years, we hold either a face-to-face conference or an online one. The last one was a face-to-face one in Rotterdam in June, which was a great success. We had virtually 100 people there, and everybody who went absolutely enjoyed it, and we had some extremely high-level presentations, so that was all lovely. The next face-to-face one will be in 2 years' time, in 2025 in Montreal in Canada, but we'll hold an online one next year, so look out for our call for abstracts in the spring. The programme and the recordings of all the presentations, and indeed of all the presentations from our previous 2 online conferences held in 2021 and 2022, all of those are on our website. So you can catch up on all of the presentations and see what was in the programme of each of our conferences. The webinar that we're going to hear today is part of our webinar series. The webinars are free, but as a small charity with no funding sources, donations from those who attend the webinars are always welcome. Again, details of how to donate are on the website or on the flyer that you may have seen enable you to log in. And the technical side of these webinars, running the video conferencing systems, making recordings and so on, are undertaken by 2 of our colleagues in Finland, Emmi Kapulia, who was also elected as an AFINet trustee at the AGM last week. So welcome, Emmi, as that role, and Suri Jorvansua. So a huge thank you to both of them. The webinar series has been running since October 2020. We set it up shortly after the pandemic started. And like the conferences, all of the presentations are also on our website if people want to catch up on a wide range of excellent and fascinating presentations we've had from all over the world, from Australia and New Zealand, through Indonesia and Malaysia, through many European countries, and from Canada, the USA and Brazil. Today's webinar comes from Australia. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephanie Merkouris. So Stephanie is a lecturer in the School of Psychology at Deakin University and is currently the recipient of a New South Wales Office of Responsible Gambling postdoctoral fellowship. She's been working as a researcher in the gambling field for 13 years. Her main research interests relate to the development and evaluation of evidence-based treatments for individuals impacted from their own or someone else's gambling behaviour, and in particular, how advances in technology can be used to advance such interventions. And today, she's going to talk to us about family member and friend treatment for gambling harm, development of a self-directed intervention. She'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for people to ask questions and for us to have a discussion. As the talk progresses, please write any questions in the chat function, and Stephanie will then answer them at the end. Or at the end, simply put up your hand using the hand function on Teams. And if that doesn't work for you, just get my attention at the end when I ask for questions, saying, "Oi, Richard, can you..." Best probably to turn your cameras off for the presentation and make sure obviously you're on mute, and then you can turn them back on again at the end when we have questions. So with no further ado, over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Richard. Let me just make sure I am sharing my screen. Hopefully everyone can see the slides.
Yes, we can.
Yep, and not my notes. Yep.
And not your notes.
Excellent. All right, great. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here presenting to you all. As indicated in the description of the webinar, my program of research relates to the development and evaluation of a self-directed intervention for families and friends affected by someone else's gambling behaviour. And now I'm going to use the term affected other in this presentation, as that is one of the terms that we do commonly use in the gambling field. And I'm actually not sure how many of you are familiar with the gambling field. I know I saw Judy online, so I know she's definitely got experience with gambling. But I thought it would be best to first provide an overview of the affected other literature in gambling before focusing in on the program of research that we've been conducting mostly at Deakin University, which then led to my postdoctoral research fellowship. And I'll then end this presentation by providing more detail on where I'm at with my fellowship project and in the development of the self-directed intervention, because my project is still ongoing, so I haven't quite finished that yet. Okay, so next slide, hopefully. Okay, so compared to the alcohol and substance use literature, the gambling field is further behind in its understanding of how gambling impacts on the families and friends of people who gamble. Given this, we were funded a few years back by the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation to conduct a scoping review of the affected other gambling literature. And this scoping review was actually led by Professor Nikki Dowling at Deakin University, with a strong team of researchers from Deakin University, including myself, as well as people from New Zealand and Canada, who I've listed on the slide here. And the purpose of the scoping review was to map the recent literature on affected others in the gambling field. And our goal in this project was to create a bit of a one-stop shop that could be used to inform clinical research and policy decision-making. And this review was really broad. It aimed to examine research relating to addressing gambling harm to affected others. But more specifically, as you can see on the slide here, the review aimed to explore issues related to 6 major themes. And this included prevalence, sociodemographic profiles, harms experienced, coping strategies used, assessment of affected others, and interventions for affected others as well. So again, we conducted a scoping review, and for those of you who don't know, it's basically a review that uses a really broad systematic search, and we did that so we could capture all of the research relating to affected others in the last 20 years. And given that there's discordance in the reports between people who gamble and their affected others, we focused only on studies in which affected others reported their own experiences. So again, we were wanting to get the perspective of the affected other. And we ended up with 88 studies in this scoping review. And interestingly, most of them were actually conducted in Australia. Most of them employed quantitative cross-sectional designs, and most of them used samples of affected others who were seeking treatment. And there were roughly an equal number of studies that used samples of only intimate partners and those that used samples of any type of affected other as well. And on the slide here, you can see a mapping exercise, which shows that the investigation of gambling harm, which is in the bigger blue letters there, has attracted the most research effort compared to any other topic of the 6 topics that we were interested in. So what we found was that 71% of the studies contributed information relating to harm. And then we had 44% that related to treatment, 26% related to coping strategies, 17% related to assessment, and only 10% related to prevalence and 5% related to sociodemographic profiles. So when exploring the prevalence of affected others, what we found in this review is that the focus of the literature is on intimate partners, but we do know that gambling-related harm also impacts many other family members and their friends as well. So the prevalence of affected others in the general population actually ranges from as low as 2% to as high as 19%. And that really indicates that there is a considerable proportion of people that may require some support and assistance in relation to harm arising from another person's gambling. And these estimates vary due to a range of factors, and these can include things like the definition of affected others that the studies employed, the rigor of the measure that they employed, and as well as the time frame, so whether they looked at current or lifetime affected other status. Now, other main findings for prevalence suggested that the gambling problem of one individual has direct negative effects on at least 6 others. And interestingly, the longitudinal literature actually showed that affected other status appears relatively unstable across time. So almost half of affected others were no longer classified as an affected other 1 year later. And those who were no longer defined as affected others reported improvements across a range of domains. So moving on to the second topic, that the scoping review covered, which related to the sociodemographic profiles of affected others, what we found is that there were really only a small number of studies that examined sociodemographic characteristics of affected others in the general population. And these studies found mixed results in relation to sex, age, marital status, and education. And these findings are most likely explained by the fact that studies use different definitions of affected other status. And there were also single studies that found that affected others were characterised by living in a city, being a male immigrant, and living on social welfare. This section also found that there was evidence that the influence of sociodemographic characteristics are actually reduced once other factors are taken into consideration, and this includes things like gambling and health-related factors. Now, our third topic within the scoping review related to harm, and within this, there were 3 different topic areas that were covered. And as you can see from the word cloud on this slide, we found that the majority of studies contributed data to the types and extent of gambling-related harm that was experienced by affected others, with much fewer studies exploring the concordance in harm between the person who gambles and their affected other, and the burden of harm to affected others as well. So just to help explain this slide, in the gambling field, there is a conceptual framework of harms that has been developed by researchers at Central Queensland University. And this framework organises harms within 7 broad domains, which you can see on the slide here. And these domains are separated into 3 temporal categories, including general harms, crisis harms, and legacy harms. And our review was the first to organise the harms experienced by affected others according to this taxonomy, so that we could accurately identify the research gaps. And as you can see in the word cloud on the bottom right, our mapping exercise revealed that research effort over the last 20 years has predominantly been directed towards the identification of emotional and relationship harms, with fewer studies looking at financial and health harms, and a very small number of studies looking at criminal, work or study, and cultural harms. Now, in order to make sense of this large group of studies, we organised the literature even further by looking at different ways that studies measured harm. So what we found was that harms can be measured in 3 ways. First, there is quantitative research that measures harm that can be attributed to gambling. So these studies will normally use items like, I have felt depressed because of another person's gambling. So these items are really linking the feelings of depression to the person's gambling behaviour. There are also qualitative methods that also measure harm with direct reference to gambling, and this is usually done via interviews or focus groups. But we also found quantitative research that measures harm without directly referencing gambling. So these studies normally use general measures of functioning that don't mention gambling, like general measures of depression. And these measures are usually standardized and validated instruments with multiple items. So it could include something like the Case 6 psychological distress scale, for example, which is a general measure of psychological distress. So this is important because studies that attribute harm to gambling may actually be less accurate and valid because they require affected others to have insight and awareness into the impacts of gambling, as well as a willingness to acknowledge these impacts. And most of these measures are single items that aren't standardized or validated, which is important to note. Conversely, measuring harm with general measures of functioning may actually be assessing difficulties that arise from a variety of sources other than gambling. And most of the studies in our review didn't really attempt to account for the contribution of other possible sources of harm, like psychiatric comorbidities or any other addictive behaviours. So what we found is that most of the studies in this section of the review actually measured harm using general measures of functioning, and that there were much smaller numbers of qualitative or quantitative studies that measured harm directly attributed to the gambling. Okay, so our main finding is in terms of the types and extent of gambling harms experienced by affected others is that intimate partners reported an initial lack of awareness about gambling-related harms, which is unsurprising given the secrecy that often surrounds gambling. We also found that the types of harm reported by affected others were largely consistent with that taxonomy that I showed earlier. And overall, studies consistently revealed that affected others reported gambling harms across all 7 of those harm domains, and that's regardless of the types of samples that they employed or the way that harm was measured. And this evidence was particularly consistent for measures in which harm was directly attributed to gambling. In contrast, we found the most equivocal findings were for research that employed general measures of functioning. Now, despite the consistency in these findings, it is likely that affected others aren't actually a homogeneous group, with harm varying by a range of factors. And this can include things like the relationship to the gambler, whether or not they live with the gambler, the severity and chronicity of the gambling problem, or the motivation of the person who gambles to change, as well as the affected other's own pre-existing psychological difficulties. All these might impact on the harms that they are experiencing. Now, when it comes to burden of harm, the main finding from our scoping review was that the quality of life of affected others was decreased by 10 to 36%. And now what this means is that affected others of gambling would prefer to live only 6.5 years of being free of gambling problems rather than 10 years with them. And finally, what we found in relation to concordance in harms between the person who gambles and affected others is that, first of all, there are a few studies that looked into this, but also that the findings are quite mixed. But generally, there is some evidence of discordance in terms of the number, severity, and types of harms. And what we found is that people who gamble, whether they're experiencing lower risk gambling or higher risk gambling related problems, they estimate that their gambling affects fewer people than the affected others do. So this potential lack of concordance suggests that the experience and interpretation of the experience may not be the same for every individual in the family, which really is an important consideration in our research. Now, the next section of this review relates to the assessment of affected others. So we actually found 22 instruments that have been specifically developed or recommended for the assessment of affected others. And hopefully you can see from the table here that these measures include measures of affected other status. So, for example, the concerned significant other DSM-4 screening questionnaire. There's assessment of stress, for example, via the symptom rating test. There seem to be several measures of harms, such as the problem gambling significant other impact scale or the problem gambling family impact scale. There are a few measures of coping as well, such as the coping questionnaire or the gambler situation inventory. There's also the short questionnaire for family members affected by addiction, which is assessing, which is a multi-dimensional assessment, of the stress, strain, coping, and social support model. There are a couple of questionnaires relating to help-seeking behaviour too. Importantly, what we found from this review, though, is that generally these measures haven't been subjected to rigorous development procedures, or they have limited psychometric information available and aren't very well validated. So there is a bit of work that we can do to improve the assessment of affected others in the gambling literature. Now, the next section of the scoping review related to affected others' use of coping strategies. Now, what we found, as you can see from the word cloud here, is that most of the studies looked at the types of coping strategies that affected others used. And there were an equal number of studies that looked at the motivations and barriers to using coping strategies and the helpfulness of these coping strategies. And what we found within this section is that affected others attempt a range of coping strategies before accessing other forms of support. And this is most likely due to the various barriers to seeking professional help. Now, one of the things I want to flag, because it is a common theme throughout my presentation, is that these coping strategies can be classified as gambler focused. So these are strategies that aim to support the affected other, influence the gambling behaviour, or they can be family focused, which aim to increase affected other and family well-being. We also found that informal support, financial strategies, support groups, and online services are some of the more commonly employed coping strategies by affected others. And lastly, we found that affected others report low levels of social support and are often reluctant to disclose information about gambling to friends and family members as well. Now, when it comes to the motivations and barriers to using coping strategies, what we found is that some of the more common motivators related to concerns about the gambling, negative emotions, and experiencing financial problems. But affected others also indicated a diverse range of barriers, such as self-reliance, shame, concerns about others' ability to help, confidentiality, and others actually treating the person who gambles as an addict or being mentally ill. Now, the last section of the coping strategies component of the review explored how helpful affected others actually found these coping strategies. And while there were a few studies that have actually examined effectiveness or helpfulness of these strategies, we found that encouraging help seeking, protecting joint accounts, communicating negative consequences, self-care strategies, peer support, and positive beliefs and attitudes can actually be helpful. Section of the scoping review explored the treatments for affected others in the gambling field. And now there were 39 studies that were included in the treatment component of our scoping review. And what we found was that 11 studies contributed data to the evaluation of couple and family treatments. And this was followed by 10 studies that evaluated the effectiveness of affected other treatments. So those are treatments that are delivered directly to the affected other. There were also 10 studies that evaluated professional help seeking motivations and barriers, 8 that evaluated professional help seeking preferences, 7 that evaluated the impact of affected other involvement in the gambling treatment, and 6 studies that evaluated the prevalence of professional help seeking. So when it comes to the prevalence of professional help seeking, affected others make up approximately 15 to 26% of people seeking support from gambling treatment services. And this review was actually quite interesting in revealing that affected others are generally unaware of the various sources of gambling help. So while affected others are aware that general practitioners, for example, are a source of help, they don't necessarily consider them to be an appropriate gambling help provider. In contrast, relationship counsellors, alcohol and drug services, financial counsellors, legal advisors, and face-to-face counselling are some of the more commonly known sources of gambling help for affected others. So the motivations and barriers to treatment section of the review covered quite a few different areas, which I've presented on the slide here. But generally, affected others display heterogeneous treatment preferences, motivations, presenting issues, and treatment needs, which really does complicate the development of interventions for affected others of gambling. And while there are various reasons why affected others present to treatment, gambling problems typically have to be quite severe before affected others will seek assistance. And that is quite similar to individuals who gamble as well. We tend to wait for that rock bottom to hit before they seek professional assistance. We found that some of the more common motivators for affected others seeking professional help include experiencing negative emotions, problems maintaining normal daily activities, concerned about the gambling becoming a major problem, worrying about the welfare of their dependents and their physical health as well. And affected others are reluctant to seek professional help due to shame and stigma. But other barriers include lack of awareness about available services, like I mentioned earlier, as well as a lack of awareness that services are free, which they are here in Australia. They're also concerned that they would be advised to confront the person who gambles, which isn't necessarily something that every affected other wants to do. We also found that affected others prefer low intensity interventions. So things like self-help, telephone support, and online support. And this is due to their potential anonymity, discretion, and ease of access. And I really want to draw your attention to the bottom right corner, which relates to treatment needs, because there has been some research that's shown that affected others do want gambler-focused approaches, which, if you recall, relate to interventions that aim to address the gambling behaviour. With fewer wanting family-focused approaches and even fewer wanting a blend of these approaches. Now, as you can see from the slide here, there are various treatments for affected others, and about half of these treatments relate to couples and family-based treatments, such as congruence couples therapy and behavioural couples therapy. And now I won't go into too much detail about these, as my research area really does focus on interventions that are delivered to affected others alone and that don't rely on the person who gambles being there. Now, the other half of the studies in this part of the scoping review evaluated treatments that were delivered directly to affected others. And as you can see from that column on the left, this can include things like gambling helplines and online services, which appear to be acceptable professional options for affected others. They also include lower intensity self-directed internet-delivered interventions, which have also displayed good feasibility and acceptability, as well as promising efficacy outcomes. And what we found is that the most evaluated intervention, albeit by 3 studies, is the community reinforcement approach and family training. So that's CRAFT. And our review found that when delivered as an individual face-to-face intervention, CRAFT appeared to be highly acceptable, with promising results regarding changes over time for most of the outcomes. So that's from pre-intervention to a post-intervention time point. But has generally failed to display many improvements when CRAFT has been compared to a control condition of some kind. Our review also found single studies that evaluated the 5-step method in the gambling field that was delivered via a workbook. And there's also one study that's looked at coping skills training as well. And both of these appear to display promising results, but ultimately more research is needed to subject these interventions to more rigorous evaluation as well. So ultimately, what this scoping review showed is that there is a lot of work to be done in this space, given so few treatments for affected others of gambling have been developed and evaluated. In particular, given the promising nature of lower intensity self-directed internet-delivered interventions for affected others, this was a space that I was really interested in further exploring. So again, as shown on the previous slide, the scoping review highlighted how few interventions have been evaluated for affected others of gambling. So the next step in my program of research was to learn from the broader addiction literature, in the hope that we might be able to inform future interventions for affected others of gambling. So we were able to get some funding from the New South Wales Office of Responsible Gambling to conduct a systematic review and meta-analysis that aimed to explore the effectiveness of affected other interventions, and that's delivered across the addictions to help inform gambling treatments. And this meta-analysis has been published in the journal Addiction for anyone wanting to look it up, or you can contact me afterwards and I'm more than happy to send it along. Now, the aim of this systematic review and meta-analysis was to determine the effectiveness of psychosocial interventions delivered to affected others across the addictions, and to determine the durability of intervention effects, and that's relative to passive control groups. We also want to take a step further to explore whether meta-analytic findings were robust to clinically relevant factors. So looking at different things like whether addiction type or mode of intervention delivery or intervention approach had any impact on these results. So on this slide, I've outlined the methods used in this review. Really quickly, we conducted a rigorous systematic search to identify relevant articles published up until August 2021. And this included things like electronic database searches, search of the grey literature, and a manual search of the reference list of included studies. Now, studies were included if they evaluated the effectiveness of a psychosocial intervention that was delivered to affected others, and these were affected others of alcohol use, substance use, gambling, or gaming. The study had to be a randomized control trial with a passive control group, and our criteria were that the affected other and the person experiencing the addiction were 18 years of age or older. Data was systematically extracted, and we also assessed risk of bias using the Cochrane risk of bias tool. But importantly, what I found when starting this systematic review is that there are a lot of outcomes assessed in this literature. So normally for a meta-analysis, you actually decide on the outcomes that you're looking at a priori. But because I was really just getting my head into this literature, we ended up using a data-driven approach to identify and finalise the range of outcomes that we would be assessing. And this ended up including a range of affected other outcomes, so things like depressive symptoms, outcomes that related to the person experiencing the addiction, such as treatment entry or decreasing alcohol use or something like that, and relationship functioning outcomes as well, which was specifically marital or relationship discord. And we conducted meta-analyses that explored the effectiveness of these interventions at an immediately post-treatment time point, as well as a shorter term follow-up, which was around 4 to 11 months. And as indicated in the aims, we did conduct sensitivity analyses to see how these different types of factors might influence the meta-analytic results. The review included 20 studies, 15 of which were included in the meta-analysis. And what we found was that the majority of studies were based on samples of people impacted by someone else's alcohol use. And most of these studies were conducted in the United States. Now, interestingly, most of the interventions targeted spouses or partners only, rather than opening up their studies to any family member or friend. Now, as a reminder, the scoping review demonstrated that there are two types of strategies and interventions that affected others might want to seek assistance for, and this included family-focused interventions which aim to help the affected other manage the impacts of the addictive behaviour, or addiction person focus, in which the intervention or strategy aims to equip the affected others to support the addictive person into treatment or to reduce their behaviour. And what we found is that most studies evaluated a blend of both of these approaches, followed by some family-focused only interventions and some addicted person only focused interventions. But despite this breakdown, interestingly, almost all of the included studies evaluated affected other outcomes, even if that wasn't in the aim of the intervention, or there wasn't content that really related to that. There were a number of interventions evaluated across the addictions, but craft was the most studied, with 25% of the included interventions looking at a craft-based intervention. And this was followed by coping skills training and pressures to change interventions at 15% each. So really quickly, what we found in the post-treatment meta-analysis is that the intervention groups, so any psychosocial intervention, was able to demonstrate significantly better outcomes on coping skill acquisition, depressive symptoms of the affected other, and life satisfaction of the affected other, but not psychological distress, anxiety symptoms, and addiction-related harms. When it came to the addicted person treatment outcomes, you can see in bold are the significant findings, so you can see that these interventions were able to increase treatment entry for the addicted person, but didn't really have an impact on frequency of alcohol use or substance use or gambling. And they were also able to improve marital and relationship discord outcomes as well. And again, this is compared to a passive control. And what we found was that there were actually no significant differences between the intervention and control groups at that short-term follow-up, which again was between 4 and 11 months post-treatment. So there is a bit of work that we can do there as well to see how we can improve, I guess, intervention durability. And when restricting the meta-analyses to studies that only looked at people impacted by alcohol use, what we found is that the results were still significant. So psychosocial interventions were still performing better than control groups in reducing affected other depressive symptoms, but not life satisfaction, able to still improve on addicted person treatment entry and marital and relationship discord. And when we also limited to studies that were delivered via a therapist as opposed to self-directed, again, depressive symptoms still improved, but not life satisfaction, and marital and relationship discord improved as well. And what we've, unfortunately, there weren't enough studies to conduct any further analyses on intervention approach, which I would have been really keen on to see if things like craft or coping skills training made a difference to these outcomes. So after completing the 2 reviews I've just described, I really saw an opportunity for a way in which I can contribute and advance the gambling field. So I applied for a postdoctoral fellowship, which I was successful in obtaining, and I'm currently still on. And that's thank you to the New South Wales Office of Responsible Gambling. And the overall aim of the fellowship is to develop and evaluate an evidence-informed self-directed intervention for people impacted by someone else's gambling. And this program of research consists of 3 studies, and I'll spend the remaining of the presentation talking through these, and as well as including progress to date, because as I said before, I'm still partway through my fellowship. Okay, so as I just mentioned, the postdoc fellowship consists of 3 studies, all that relate to the development and evaluation of the self-directed intervention. Now, after conducting the previous systematic review, I had a sense of the general effectiveness of the available psychosocial interventions in the literature, but I still felt like I needed a lot more information before I could commence developing any new intervention. And this is why the first study within my fellowship was another systematic review and meta-analysis. But this review differed because instead of broadly looking at intervention effectiveness, I really went down to the individual change technique level to get a sense of the active ingredients or components that make a treatment effective and therefore help inform the development of the intervention for my fellowship. So specifically, this review aimed to identify the frequency of the behaviour change techniques present in the available psychosocial intervention. And again, this is across the addictions. And we also wanted to determine whether the use of specific BCTs, so behaviour change technique groups, are associated with greater intervention effectiveness. And this review has been published in Clinical Psychology Review. So again, shout out if anyone would like me to send that to them. So again, I've outlined the methods here, but basically we use the same systematic research as the one that we used in the addiction article, but we updated the search to include articles published up until September 2022. Our inclusion criteria was slightly different. We still only included interventions or studies that evaluated a psychosocial intervention for affected others of alcohol use, substance use, gambling, or gaming. But we broadened the criteria to include any randomized control trial with any control or comparison group. And we also wanted to make and the studies were only included if they had a sufficient description of the intervention, so we could actually classify the behaviour change techniques as well. There was a similar data extraction and risk of bias process in this review, but importantly, to identify the behaviour change techniques used in the affected other interventions across the addictions, we adapted Susan Mischie's 2013 behaviour change technique taxonomy, and this is one of the most comprehensive taxonomies that are available. It consists of 93 techniques that can be grouped into 16 BCT groups, but we also added 7 more behaviour change technique groups that were relevant to the content area that weren't really covered by that taxonomy. And the meta-analysis for this for this review included the same outcomes as that in the previous review I just mentioned, but this analysis focused on exploring the effectiveness of each individual BCT group across each outcome. So 32 studies were included in the systematic review, with 25 providing data for inclusion in the meta-analysis. And unfortunately, there are way too many BCT groups and not enough time to talk through them all. But here I have listed the 5 most used BCT groups across the affected other intervention literature. And this shows that most interventions include at least one technique that relates to shaping knowledge. So that's information on antecedents, on the nature of addiction, and information on the change process in general. And more than half of the studies also included a technique that relates to natural consequences. And again, this is really just about providing information on the consequences of a behaviour. And just over half of studies included techniques that related to setting goals and developing action plans, repeating a new behaviour or substituting an unwanted behaviour. And lastly, several studies also included a technique that related to confrontation of the addicted person to engage in treatment. So the results of this meta-analysis actually threw up some interesting and conflicting results. But generally, what we found is that BCTs, so behaviour change techniques, that involve monitoring the addicted person's behaviour and providing rewards or punishment dependent on that behaviour does not improve the mental health of the affected other, but it may actually reduce the harms that they are experiencing due to the addictive behaviour. And this review also showed that restoring a balanced lifestyle can help improve affected other psychological distress. The review also showed that these interventions that aim to help the affected other support the addicted person may benefit from the inclusion of techniques from BCT groups that include behavioural substitution, behavioural rehearsal, and non-specific reward as well. And really interestingly, this review found that interventions that included confrontation of the addicted person to engage into treatment were actually associated with significant improvements over time for marital and relationship functioning. Whereas interventions without this BCT actually showed no change. So that was a really interesting finding that I wasn't necessarily expecting. And now the second study of my fellowship is what's called an intervention mapping study, which ultimately leads to the development of a self-directed treatment using an evidence-informed approach. Now, to complete this study, we are bringing together all the knowledge I've already presented, as well as other literature and studies to try and develop this evidence-informed treatment. And this study is still in progress, so this is what I'm up to in the fellowship, but I did want to present an overview, I guess, of what we have so far and key sources of research that we are currently drawing from to inform the intervention development. So in addition to the previous reviews, we've also got a study that was led by Simone Rodda in New Zealand back in 2020. And this was one of the first studies that was able to gain the perspective of affected others and explore what they are wanting from treatment. So this included perspectives from 62 family members seeking help for the impact from someone else's gambling via an internet service. And again, this study did come up in the scoping review, so I won't repeat the findings, but basically I just wanted to reiterate that that affected others do have varying treatment needs, which can include gambler-focused approaches, family-focused approaches, and a blend of these approaches too. Another study conducted by Natalia Booth, who, again, also a New Zealand researcher that we work closely with. And this study also drew upon an in-depth exploration of the self-help strategies used by affected others of gambling. So this study aimed to develop a comprehensive data-driven taxonomy of the types of self-help strategies used by affected others. and to categorize these into high-level behavior change techniques. So this is similar to the study, my first study within the fellowship, but instead of using the published intervention literature to classify the BCTs, our team here used data from the affected others themselves to develop 2 taxonomies, which were then applied to a data set of online sources. And these taxonomies, again, were family focused, which related to reducing the impact of gambling harm on families. And there was a gambler focused taxonomy as well, which was all about how to support the gambler in behavior change. Now in total, there were 329 online sources containing 3,536 different self-help strategies identified. And what we were able to develop was a family-focused taxonomy, which included 16 behavior change techniques. And the most frequently discussed techniques within that family-focused taxonomy included professional support, financial management, and planned consequences. And the gambler-focused taxonomy contained 11 behavior change techniques. And the most frequent within this taxonomy were feedback on behaviors, professional support, and financial management as well. Now, unfortunately, we don't have data relating to the effectiveness or perceived helpfulness of these self-help strategy groups, but understanding what affected others are actually using is still a very helpful resource for informing intervention development. Now, other work that is going into informing the intervention mapping process includes a recent study that I was funded to do by the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation. And the main focus of this study was actually to explore the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the harms experienced by affected others of gambling via semi-structured interviews. Now, within these interviews, we also explored the coping strategies used and any professional help seeking affected others sought during this time. And affected others in this sample discussed their experiences of, once again, family-focused strategies and help seeking, which included content that related to psychoeducation, social support, and avoiding or setting boundaries with the person who gambles. And they also discussed their experiences of gambler-focused support, in which the affected others tried to talk to the person who gambles about reducing or ceasing their gambling behaviour. They also tried to prompt professional help seeking, but they also assisted the person who gambles with financial-based strategies such as setting limits or setting up a budget. And they were also helpful with identifying alternative activities to gambling and assisting with self-exclusion as well. Now, lastly, we have been conducting surveys with current clinical researchers and service providers in the gambling field to get their sense of the type of content that family-focused and gambler-focused interventions for affected others could include. And now the clinician surveys are still in progress, so I won't talk to those. We have completed surveys from 19 gambling clinical researchers worldwide, and they've indicated that social support and financial management should be included in both family and gambling-focused interventions, as well as communication training for family-focused interventions and goals and planning for gambling-focused interventions too. So to further help the intervention mapping process, we put together a planning group, which consists of 5 service providers, researchers, and people with lived experience as well. And their tasks are to review the aims of the intervention. And when it's all finalised, they will also be asked to review the content of the intervention in detail as well. And based on their feedback to the intervention aims proposed, we have put together the intervention aims, which you can see on the slide here. But basically, given the differing and potentially fluctuating treatment needs of affected others, which has been shown across the literature so far, this intervention will include 2 separate streams. And the first stream will aim to address the affected other needs by reducing their psychological distress. And the second stream will address the gambler-focused needs of the affected other by helping the affected other support the individual who gambles to decrease their gambling behaviour. Now, the content for these two streams is currently being developed, but based on the feedback provided by the planning group, the reviews of the literature that we've conducted, and the interviews and surveys that we've conducted with affected others and are conducting with service providers and researchers, we have started developing content that includes content that's outlined in the table here, but this is an iterative process, so changes are being made as needed, including adding new content or cutting down content depending on length as well. So this isn't a final list of the types of activities that will be included, but it should hopefully give you a sense of the type of content we're wanting to include. And the other key component of this intervention that I'm hoping to be able to do from a technological perspective, will be the only limitation, is that I want all content to be made available to users from the moment they sign up to the intervention. We're going to make it really clear to users that while there are these two streams for them to pick from, they can pick and choose whichever activity they like across each stream, and they're not limited to either stream. So I really do want the affected other to be able to pick an activity relevant to them in that moment. So it is important that the intervention and the different streams are clearly described, as well as the activities are clearly described, so that way the affected other can really make an informed choice in that moment about what it is they're wanting support for. And now just really quickly, the final study of my fellowship will be a single-arm trial that aims to evaluate the feasibility, acceptability and preliminary effectiveness of the online self-directed program. We will recruit approximately 30 affected others who are wanting support for themselves or wanting help to support the person who gambles. And this trial will be restricted to Australia. But if all goes well and hopefully get more funding, I would love to be able to do something larger and more international as well. But that is the end of my presentation. So please let me know if you have any questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Stephanie, for a very clear and very interesting presentation, covering a huge amount of ground.
Covered a lot again. I'll stop presenting, Richard, just
yeah,
so we can
lovely.
see everyone's faces.
Stop presenting.
Yeah.
Do so we can all go back on, and people who wish to now, please turn your cameras back on. I've got a load of questions, but I won't go first. Stephanie's got her hand up. The other Stephanie, we've got two Stephanies here. So Stephanie, Stephanie S, please ask your question to Stephanie M.
Stephanie, do you know, I just want to say, because I'm going to have to jump off shortly, my husband and I are sort of well known in the UK, and we are national voices for gambling harm and raising an awareness, and it's fantastic to meet you all. And those of you that may have heard of me and my husband and the work that we've been doing with the government to try and raise awareness, I was delighted to come along today, because my husband had a gambling addiction for nearly 50 years, and I was an affected other. So we tend to have a voice, one from his perspective and one from mine, and we climbed a mountain out of this gambling addiction together. Yeah, it's so exciting, because one of the things I do say is for affected others, I think even in Australia, there's still so much that needs to be done, and there's so much support that needs to be looked at. So I just wanted to sort of share that with you all and say, you know, it's fantastic, because we are just as much a victim of gambling harm as what the addict is. And so to see pockets of work being done like this is wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Stephanie. Would you be okay if I were to reach out and maybe have a bit of a chat? Because again, we are still in that intervention development phase.
Yeah,
and I would love
definitely.
to pick as many brains as possible to make sure we're getting this right.
I've just started to develop a service for Gordon Moody, which is a gambling addiction treatment service here in the UK. I love their treatment. I know that's really how I got my husband through gambling addiction. We did it on our own. We wrote a book as well about it to try and reach out to individuals, but also we're working with Bristol University Hub, and I am so keen to get studies and research going on affected others, because 6 weeks counselling therapy will not cure and it gets an affected other where they want to go. It's a long recovery, and yeah, we need to get it right for these individuals that are suffering. What I loved about today's perspective was something I've always said. Here in the UK, we're so focused on counselling. I couldn't have been fixed in 6 weeks of counselling. And my emotional side of the impact of gambling harm, I was in crisis mode. So those financial aspects need to be looked at. You know, they really need to be counted in. So yes, please do share my details with everyone, and thank you.
One thing that would be very helpful, Stephanie, is if you could put on chat, if you could put a way of contacting you, your email or a website or something, that would be very helpful. I see Jim's got his hand up, but I'm going to take Anne first. Anne said, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. Do you have time to explain a little further the BCT piece regarding the confrontation aspect? And I was going to ask a related question, so let me ask mine at the same time.
Yeah.
You, on your slide, you put together two things which I see as being potentially very different. So you put together confrontation and you put together attempting to get the person to engage in treatment. And it strikes me there are many ways that an affected other could attempt to get their person into treatment, of which confrontation is only one small bit of it. So was that actually about confrontation? Was it actually about engagement? Could you explain a little more about that?
Yeah, so the Confrontation BCT group was actually one of the groups that we created. It was a part of Mishy's original taxonomy, so this is obviously quite specific to the affected other literature. So it was one that we created, and we did keep it a bit more broad. So it actually did include, yes, that kind of confrontation type of intervention, as well as people encouraging and prompting any treatment seeking. So we did include, I guess you're right, two conflicting types of interventions.
Yeah. And one of the things you said that people worry about right at the beginning was that they're going to be asked to confront, or they're going to be pushed to confront when they don't want to. And I'm slightly concerned that by putting those two together, you're sort of encouraging people to think that actually opening a discussion with your loved one about their gambling and whether they need to do something about it has to be done in a confrontative way, as opposed to thinking about the wide range of ways that people can do that.
Yeah, I strongly do not want to include anything in my intervention that can come across as being confrontative. I think having those conversations is a really important part of an affected other intervention, but I think doing that in the right way is really important. And I do agree, Richard. I think that we probably could have broken that down into two different BCTs. Thinking about that now, and you're right.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean,
hindsight's great. But I think
plenty of time for doing that in the future.
Yeah. 100%.
Can I go back to Anne Jordan? Is that a sufficient answer to your question, or do you want to follow it up at all? Anne's not responding, so I'll move over to Jim. Your question, please. I don't know if you want to turn your camera on or not.
No, probably not. No, but I'll my microphone. You can hear me at least.
Okay, you're still in your dressing gown.
Well, Stephanie, thank you very much for your talk. I mean, really, gosh, you've been busy. I mean, you've covered your scoping review and all the rest of the work you've been doing is so valuable, I think, and so thank you very much for all that. There's so many things one could ask about, but just one I'd like to focus on, and it particularly follows on, I suppose, from what Stephanie Shilton was just saying about how how big a thing it is being an affected other, where there's a gambling problem, is a major life thing. And I was very struck by your mention of the quality of life work, and I wasn't aware of that. And I can't remember how many studies you said it was based on, but you said that the range of findings was that gambling affected others' quality of life was reduced by 10 to 36%. So if I've understood the way in which those figures are produced, let's say 20% is somewhere in the middle of that range. So are we saying that the sort of average person who's been asked these sorts of questions is saying, I would give up 1 year of the next 5 years of my life. I would gladly give up one of those years if the person that I'm concerned about were to stop this gambling problem and the gambling problem. Have I understood what that's saying? Because you see, the reason why this is so important is that we do have a problem in convincing the rest of the world that this is a major health and social problem. And if I've understood what you've said there, what you've summarised about the quadrant, this is a figure I am going to quote next time I have an opportunity to give any sort of talk about how serious this is. Have I understood correctly?
Okay, I'm going to be completely upfront, Jim, and this is work that's been conducted by Central Queensland University researchers. So this is like Matt Brown and Matt Rockloff in Australia, which maybe some of you know, and this is 100% their area of expertise. So I would defer to looking into this further for you, but generally speaking, yes, your understanding is correct. The way that my understanding of how these questions are being asked as well is that they're actually outright asking them, like, how many years are you willing to give up to be without gambling problems or to live with someone without gambling problems? So it is actually, so I'm not sure about again, if that 20% is that 1 in 5 that you're referring to. So that's where I'm not 100% sure on the numbers, Jim. But generally speaking, that's what this research is showing. So all of the burden of harm research that the CQU researchers are doing does relate to that. It's how many years of my life am I willing to give up in order to be without a gambling problem in my life?
Wow.
I mean, that seems to be such a powerful thing. And can you just remind us, if you remember, how many studies we're talking about here? Are we talking about more than just a small handful, or?
No, it's a handful. So they've done their research. So they've definitely done it in the Victorian population, and they've done a New Zealand study as well. I'm not sure if they've done much more, but I can send you some stuff if you're interested, Jim. Like I've got the specific, because I've got the specific reports, and I think they've published papers from it. If worst case scenario, they're buried in some of their Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation reports, but the numbers are there.
Yes,
so
please.
If you like, I can send. I'll just make a note. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jim, for that very interesting question. No other hands are up. Let me just put it up in with a couple more, and then people are starting to leave, and so we do need to wrap it up a bit. But let me just ask you 2 other things. One is the self-directed intervention you're planning on developing. It sounded to me as if you were saying very, very clearly that you wanted people to be able to pick and choose what of the relatively large number of options there were in there, that people would be able to select so that they could get what they needed when they needed it, which I think is a really laudable aim. But the other side of it is that implies that there won't be a structure. And one of the things that our work with the 5-step method, and that when talking to people who use craft and other structured interventions suggest, is that one of the things that both practitioners and family members like hugely is having a bit of structure, because they feel their life is very, very chaotic, and knowing that there's a structure which they can then work through with freedom within the structure, but knowing that the structure is there is actually very helpful. How are you going to deal with that?
So that's a very good point, Richard. And my thinking, and again, it hasn't been finalized, but my thinking was that again, it's all about how we describe it, but it's also how you present it, even because this is this online program, right? So even if if you present something again, even if you don't add numbers, but let's just say financial skills comes first, followed by communication training, people will follow through in order. So my general thinking was to address that is I do want to make it clear when describing that they can do it they can pick any stream that they want, they can pick any activity that they want, but if they do want to follow a structure, then they can go from start to finish based on the order of the activities is what I was thinking. But not necessarily like, again, I'm in two minds about whether I actually number them or not, but even if you just present it in an order, like I'm the same, I kind of start, go from start to end when I do things, right? When I'm looking at something, it's human nature. So that was my thinking on that.
Okay, well, I look forward to seeing that grow as you do more work and start to develop a pilot of it and so on and so forth. And I'm sure many of the people who are here today would be very happy to look over that and make comments and suggestions if that would be helpful. One other question. One of the things that unfortunately we know very strongly from the gambling literature is how common suicide is in people who themselves have gambling problems. Are you planning on doing anything about suicide risk management for affected others?
It's on the radar. And it's something that I'm talking about. So just for context as well, so Professor Nikki Dowling is my mentor, who's a clinical psychologist. I'm working very closely with her on finalising the content for this. I'm always a bit concerned with self-directed interventions about how deep we can go. But I'm keen on feedback if people do think it hasn't come up as something that in all of the research that I've done, it hasn't come up as something that's super important and needing to be included. It's kind of coming up somewhere in the middle, like of all the types of activities we could include. So it's on the radar, but we haven't made a final decision about it. But I'm happy to get people's thoughts with that kind of stuff as well. If there's, if I got consensus from the AFINet that it definitely needs to be in, that's one way I can write that up.
It may not apply. It certainly doesn't apply to every family, but for the families to which it does apply, it's so big and so important and so serious that maybe that's a reason. If you think about a sort of a risk management matrix, it's something that may not be as frequent, but it's so massively important that even though it may not be as frequent, there may be at least some signposting. There's one more question from Anne. She says, one more question that may be a no-brainer. Did your scoping exercise confirm that affected other participation in treatment significantly positively impacts the treatment of their loved one in addiction? So does adding the affected other into treatment, is that a positive effect?
Yes. I didn't go into the affected other involvement in the gambler's treatment, but yes, it is a positive effect.
Okay, and that's, I think, a general finding that involvement of families in intervention generally, obviously there are examples where it's not, but generally it is very positive. If for no other reason, that it means that the affected other knows what's going on in treatment, and their behaviour therefore can help in the same direction, as opposed to inadvertently doing things which are in the opposite direction. So it makes a lot of sense as to why having a family member involved, even if that's the only thing, and there are many other reasons why it's positive, but if that's the only one, it's a very, very positive one, that inadvertently you're not going to do the wrong thing. Okay, we need to go. We've lost about half of our number, because lots of people give an hour for this and then go off to the next meeting. So can I just say thank you so very much, Stephanie, for this, a really excellent and interesting presentation, a very nice discussion afterwards as well, with lots of questions. We look forward to hearing about the next phase, when you're actually doing the work on developing and then testing the intervention. To say to everybody else that the online recording will be on the website. either by the end of this week or early next week. So thank you very much again for that. And to say that the next webinar, which I will advertise now, is also from Australia. It's by Annette Peart and Rob Campbell from the Australian organisation Turning Point, which is not the same Turning Point as we have in England, and from Monash University. And they're going to talk about an Australian case study of an online group education and support program called Breakthrough: Families Understanding Addiction. And that's going to be on Tuesday, the 14th of November, so two months from now. Because both their and our clocks are changing, it's going to be at 9 o'clock UK time, 10 o'clock most of Europe, 11 o'clock Finnish time, and 8 o'clock in the evening they're starting in Melbourne. So they're going from 8 till 10. So thank you again, Stephanie. Thank you for everybody who joined and for all the questions. And I look forward to seeing all of you in 2 months' time.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.
Thank